every prediction keeps being shown to be too conservative when it comes to the lowering of cost of renewable energy and the speed of uptake of people trying to do it themselves. You only have to look at the uptake of the battery program and batteries, that's been great. Governments then lag behind in not making sure it's available to more people, like stratas are not having access to the batteries subsidies, for example. We need to be doing more to ensure renters and people in medium to high density have access to cleaner energy and cheaper energy. So there's so many ways in which the government can be more ambitious.
Yes.
We need to keep pushing them.
Welcome to Climate 360. I'm delighted to welcome Zali Steggall, the independent member for Warringah, to today's podcast. And as we do with our podcast, we like to ask our guests to just very quickly introduce. Everyone will know who you are, but from your perspective, the 1 minute summary of Zali Steggall. Who are you?
1 minute, 60 seconds or less. Who am I? Look, I live in Warringah, which is the North Shore, northern beaches of Sydney. Born in Manly, I have had the privilege to represent Australia at 4 Winter Olympic Games as an alpine skier. I then went on to have a career in law as a barrister. I practiced in many areas. And since 2019, I have been in politics, very much on the basis of fighting for climate actions, to champion merit, fact-based policy around the big issues of our time. I think as a mum, as a professional, as an advocate, I felt that we needed politics to be brought back into the hands of communities and non-career politicians who could look at issues in a more impartial way, free of ideology, and focused on policy that is fact-based.
That's really interesting. That the seat that you actually won, of course, has to be said, was previously held by one of probably the most prominent climate deniers in Australian political recent history.
And that was the main reason for me getting into politics, right? I, after being a professional athlete and a barrister for 10 years, I had spent some time railing at the TV, horrified at what was done about, the arguments he put forward and his constant undermining of climate science and what we needed to do as a country to be safe for future generations. And so for me as a professional woman, I felt that if I didn't step in to take on the responsibility of providing my community with an alternative option when it came to the federal election, you're complicit in the problem. And so for me, putting forward for the people of Warringah an alternative option of representation to what Tony Abbott represented was incredibly important.
What gave you the confidence at that time, noting that he had a significant majority at that point, and it had been in Liberal hands since it began in 1922. It was a long time. What made you think I can win this? Did you get a feeling from the community that they were ready for a change?
Absolutely. I mean, ironically, for my entire voting life, I had no other federal representative but Tony Abbott at that time. So it was telling, but he was very out of step with our community. Our community was very forward leaning when it came to treatment of refugees, when it came to same-sex marriage plebiscite, and he had ignored the wishes of our community for a long time. So on climate, on opportunity, around where our future economic prosperity lies, all these issues, he was completely out of step. So is it an easy challenge to take on? No, but I've never been daunted by what is hard or maybe difficult. Representing Australia at the Winter Olympics is not the most obvious thing to do. A girl from Manly on the ski fields.
Yes.
As a barrister, you learn to take on that responsibility on behalf of your client to do the best you can to advocate. So I had, I was fairly up for the challenge to take him on, and to have an option for something better.
Did you, specifically talking about climate, because obviously your platform is the social justice, there's a range of different kind of components to it, but climate's a significant one. Did you have a moment, like a Damascene moment, where you thought, this is now a big part of my life that I really have to fight for? Was there always a gradual recognition of that?
It was I think it was gradual. As a professional woman, I had a strong sense of being unrepresented when it came to equality issues as well, especially seeing, it's a very patriarchal environment. Politics have traditionally not been respectful of women. So for me, as a professional woman, I felt strongly it was a responsibility to step up and provide something different, but also being fact-based. As a barrister, you put forward the case to a judge based on expert evidence. You look for where are the facts, what are the experts saying on an issue. And too much of our federal politics was based on ideology, on the vested interest of donors and lobby groups, and not nearly enough of our policy is actual based on facts, on science, on merit. And I think maybe even as an ex-Olympic athlete, I like winning, but I also like approaching an issue or a problem in a comprehensive way, looking at what are the facts, what are the science, how can we rationally have a better outcome. And to me, there was a deep frustration that federal politics, state as well, but federal in particular, was too often done on ideology and vested interests.
Well, I'd like to talk about, obviously we want to talk about energy, and recently Chris Bowen announced the 82% target of clean energy in the energy system by 2030. Figures and percentages move up and down, and one of the things that you've mentioned is this idea that people aren't listening to the science; they're kind of politicizing things. When I listened to Chris Bowen describe why he got to this 82%, I don't think it's enough. But I could see his argument around they've just gotten to power. They're holding on to power. They're probably a little bit better than the other ones. And they're trying to arbitrate, like, where's a target we can get to that is listening to the Climate Change Authority, that has some science to it, but also won't lose out their voters. Would you say that there is an arbitration that sort of needs to be found between an absolute figure? Because in a way, we'd probably say we need to be carbon free today or tomorrow.
Well, there's two questions, I think, in that. There's a question of what's a rational target for us in our energy system in terms of the transition to clean energy, and how do we move away from fossil fuel energy, powered energy, to renewables, and the speed at which that can be implemented and stored in the grid, and all of that. Noting that we also have aging coal-fired power plants that have a timeline of their own and that need replacing quickly. So that energy goal is one thing. Then we also have what is our emissions reduction target as a nation, looking at all of our systems, which goes beyond just the energy system. Granted, it's a major part of it, but we also have transport, we have industry, we have land use and agriculture. We have a number of sectors that are responsible for our overall emissions footprint. And we need ambition on that, because as a continent, we're heavily exposed to the impacts and the consequences of climate change. The risks are high. And we are big contributors through our exports around mining. We are big contributors to global warming, much on a per capita basis, much greater than just our sort of people that seem to think that we're a small nation. What can we really do? It's been put to me that we're responsible for up to 10% of global emissions when you start counting our scope 3 emissions, our exports, and the influence we could have on trading partners if we were moving them to clean technologies rather than continuing their dependence on fossil fuels. So look, Chris Bowen and the government have had a level of ambition, but they are still, I would say, doing 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because they are still approving gas projects, they are still approving additional extraction, and they are still supporting through various funding mechanisms fossil fuels. So we are on one hand saying, yes, let's transition to clean energy, let's try and have reasonably ambitious science-based nationally determined contribution goals, when it comes to our emissions reduction. But on the other hand, we are still harming the very system we're trying to improve by approving more fossil fuel projects and gas. big area that I've been trying to push Chris Bowen and the government on has been around methane monitoring. We still have very archaic, and it's guesswork what really happens around our estimates of our methane emissions from open cut and mines and others, and leaks around gas facilities. Now, methane is 80 times more potent than CO2 in the first 20 years. So in a situation where our atmosphere is warming at an accelerating rate, faster than what all experts had predicted, the focus, I find it mind-boggling that we are not focusing on what the fastest warming component is, which is LNG, which is methane. And yet the government is refusing to have proper satellite monitoring when it comes to leaks. We still facilitate venting and flaring, which means we are just letting methane go out into the atmosphere unchecked. We're still not requiring gas companies to properly ensure there are no leaks from their facilities, and and properly monitor, measure, and report methane is key to genuinely addressing our emissions. Now, the government is still dragging their feet on that front, and that's not good enough.
Yeah, you said that we are there are some progress being made, but that in some ways there is a political decision being made as to what they think they can do without losing support. Is this partly about our ability to communicate the downside of like the or else scenario? You mentioned we're a continent that is particularly prone to the kind of troubles that are coming down the line because of climate change, and yet I'm reminded of there's a quote, believe it or not, from Josh Frydenberg, which I think is really quite memorable, which is that anything is possible if it's a priority. Now, he was talking about this. So what that tells me is that, okay, so this is not yet a priority. So in a way, is this partly to do with our failure to actually talk about the kind of levels of flooding and fire and insurance policy problems and all of the kind of manufacture, all the whole world of damage that could be coming down the line? It feels like we don't really treat it as an emergency yet.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I look at the actions we as a country took when COVID hit. We were able in a very short period of time, and all of us as a nation agreed to compromise, to sacrifice certain personal liberties for the greater good, to be able to pivot and adapt and address such a big health emergency. And yet a much greater health emergency is coming when it comes to climate change as a result of our warming climate. And yet there isn't that political will to genuinely take all the steps necessary. We are still a long way from doing everything we can. The biggest example of that lack of willingness, I think, is the Oxford National Intelligence Report, which was done in 2022 when the Albanese government was elected, which is a security report around all our security agency pulling together what the climate risk threats from a national security are for Australia. Now, other nations have published declassified versions of that report so that you can genuinely understand the risk at play, right? A nation with that warning, you can then put into context the scale of that risk. The government has refused to release that, and I think it's pivotal for Australian communities to generally understand the risk they face, not just domestically from incidents, but also internationally. What does it mean for our national security in a world with a changing climate? What will that mean for population displacement, for the risk of wars? What will it mean for the highly likely scenario where wars will be fought over food and water, political instability in neighbouring countries as a result of disruption from events, to the whole geopolitical situation is all impacted. I think the Australian public should be informed of those risks to then genuinely make decisions as to our future of what is in our best interests, and that is important. So you cannot properly address a risk unless you are upfront about what that risk is to people. And there are still a lot of people with their head in the sand, ignoring the risks, even as events happen. Even just in the physical safety point of view of increased rates of bushfires and floods and droughts and tropical cyclones and storm fronts that, flash flooding, events that are happening on such a regular basis that communities have no capacity to rebuild and actually, build their resilience.
And it feels like it's a disaggregated story of disasters, but not coming together as a real kind of vision of what might be. With your electorate, do you feel that Australia's probably done quite well in terms of individual response to the energy transition? We have got a high level of rooftop take up. The battery programs are running quite well. All that behind the meter stuff seems to be quite progressive. Do you feel with your electorate that there is an understanding of what the value of that is and why they're doing that, and they're fully supportive of that? Or is it a mixed bag? Do some people say it's adding to the energy costs and that sort of thing? What's your experience?
I think, like in all communities, there's a mixed bag. But my community, I would say, Moringa, is a they're early adopters of technology, very educated, and so very open to look at what are the opportunities through the energy transition, and what are the benefits of being early adopters, metro tech kind of. And so we have a lot of industry leaders, business leaders in the electorate, and so they see the benefit of that transition and the opportunities, but they also see the cost and the risks of unchecked climate change, and why it's necessary for us to genuinely actively do something about this. There's that concern of the generational debt that we are leaving younger generations around having overdrawn the carbon budget globally, and this escalating and increasing severity of events, and the cost of those events, and of course the fact that we can't insure our way out of the climate crisis. Many communities will be uninsured. Look, on the northern beaches, the North Shore Peninsula, people are experiencing the impacts of climate change. We have coastal erosion, flash flooding, and areas that are uninsurable. So it's very real. It's happening now, and people accept that a transition's needed. The uptake in energy, and for example, I think we have a high uptake of electric vehicles. So I think there is that willingness to do what needs to be done.
At the same time, the sometimes there's a thought that for all of that change amongst consumers, perhaps that's taking the pressure a little bit off actually the grid and the electricity generation, and the bigger picture, like we're doing as individuals, are doing quite a bit of heavy lifting there. But do you think sometimes that we're not actually putting enough emphasis actually on power generation and on the transmission and the distribution and all that, the big end of energy? We still seem to be sort of held ransom to that infrastructure that was put in place initially just for coal and fossil fuels. And now we have situations of permitting where you've got all the stuff ready to go, where you've got investors coming in from all around the world. But the whole system's kind of grinding to a bit of a halt because we're not doing enough to modernize the system. Would you agree?
Absolutely. But also I think we're in this interesting conundrum where individual consumers are told you have a responsibility for the climate crisis, for the emissions that of your lifestyle, and so you have to personally make those changes. And sure, consumers are responsible for about 75% of our emissions if you look at all the things that aggregated in our lives. But that is big corporations trying to palm off the responsibility onto the individual rather than looking at their responsibility and their knowledge of what they're doing, and trying to essentially continue making profits at the expense of greater social good going forward. Transition is, I think, look, change of technology and transition is never easy. There will always be those that are early adopters and those that will hold back. I think we are in an accelerating hockey stick curve of change, and I think every prediction keeps being shown to be too conservative when it comes to the lowering of cost of renewable energy and the speed of uptake of people trying to do it themselves. You only have to look at the uptake of the battery program and home batteries, that's been great. Governments then lag behind in not making sure it's available to more people, like stratas are not having access to the batteries subsidies, for example. We need to be doing more to ensure renters and people in medium to high density have access to cleaner energy and cheaper energy. So there's so many ways in which the government can be more ambitious.
Yes.
We need to keep pushing them to.
And that's, I guess that's where policy and regulation, the classic kind of carrot and stick, you have incentives for grants, but you also have to have sticks in terms of what you aren't allowed to do. In terms of that larger picture of energy generation, one of the interesting things that's emerged quite recently is the growth of community objections to different whether it's wind farms or it's batteries, etc. I was up in the high country not long ago. You could see posters all over the place saying keep our lithium batteries out of our agricultural land. To what extent do you think that's a genuine community concern? To what extent might it be sort of inflated by, I mean, the term astro-turfing, where given a little bit of a leg up by the fossil fuel industries? Do you think there's a genuine problem there with the level of engagement and discussion with communities, or to what extent do we just need to make some painful decisions, or at least bold decisions? Say, well, we just have to somehow or other we need to get X gigahertz of power, and that means that we have to break some eggs to make omelets. Where do you feel we are in that sort of? We want to engage the community, but we also have this backlog, and we've investors pulling out because they just don't want to wait for 2 years.
Yeah. Look, I think there's a bit of everything happening. And of course, I think genuinely communities need to be consulted and part of the journey, right? You can't impose great change to all, especially regional communities who have not been part of power generation. They haven't had a coal-fired power station on their doorstep. All of a sudden, they have large-scale renewable projects, and so that is a change they need to grow accustomed to. But for example, Farmers for Climate Change have done surveys within communities that are hosting large-scale projects, and they've identified about a 70% support of people surveyed for those large-scale projects. And in fact, they do when done well,
yes,
they do deliver great benefit for landowners, for example, who then have a second revenue stream that really inoculates their farms and properties and their agricultural business against the vast changing sort of circumstances, and really provides financial security for continuing on the land. But there's no doubt there have been cowboys, and there have been situations where communities haven't been consulted or happy with projects, but also where fossil fuel funded I would say troublemakers have gone into communities, and they have amplified the voices of the minority that are not happy with progress and new technology, and they have amplified it beyond the genuine scale within that community. And we see that quite a lot. Classic example, offshore wind, the amount of misinformation around impact on the environment, impact on whales. I mean, having Barnaby Joyce turn up to a coastal community miles away from his own community, all of a sudden the great defender of whales and the environment, right, nowhere to be seen when it comes to seismic blasting or oil and gas extraction offshore that will genuinely hurt whales and their migration patterns. But all of a sudden the great defender of whales when it comes to offshore wind. Now, that is vested interest at heart, trying to push for that, put the brakes on the transition. And so I think, again, information is incredibly important, being fact-based, really genuinely looking at the data and what happens, and making sure that the voice of the vast majority of the community is amplified beyond noisy, disruptive voices.
Tell me, is the conversation about nuclear dead and buried with Mr. Dutton leaving, exiting stage left, as it were? I mean, that was a big conversation in the last election. You yourself had a dissenting paper in relation to that. Is it dead and buried, or is it still rumbling along in the basement somewhere?
Oh, goodness gracious. The coalition will stick to trying to push up nuclear for, I think, some time. Because, again, especially for the Nationals, by continually pushing nuclear, they are avoiding having to support renewables. And so from their point of view, I think that will continue. And again, I have nothing against the technology. It plays an important part in certain places of the world that does not have the benefit of plentiful renewable energy potential. But for Australia, it is just, there is not, economically and from a time point of view, there is no sensible case for it. The amount of legislative change that would be required, community consultation, and then the cost of the technology. I mean, across the energy sector, the only energy source that is inflationary, that goes up over time, is nuclear. Renewable is deflationary. Renewable costs continue to come down as more and more market power comes into online.
What would you say would be your if you had a fairy godmother in your role, and we're talking about energy in particular being one of the biggest contributors to carbon emissions we have, what would be your number one thing if you had a magic wand to do? What would you do to change the landscape and to get us to that target as fast as possible of zero emissions from energy?
Oh goodness.
We're part of it, so it's close to
If I
having a
had
magic wand, isn't it?
Look, there's some. Look, I think, to be fair, I think around the transition around energy, Chris Bowen and the government is getting on with it. The goal of 82% by 2030, I think, is very achievable, and I think we're likely to make it. I know there are different projections, but I think we continually, the community, the uptake of renewable energy continually surprises all of the estimates, and we keep accelerating pace. I think that's good news. Where we need to stop is to stop approving more gas. Like, for example, this idea that gas shortfall that we need to continue.
Yes.
So much public funding still goes into that. We are not recouping enough revenue from gas, for example. We
Yes.
have to change that, because the costs on the other side of the coin, the cost of the impacts, is increasing, and it's on track to be, I mean, it's about 38 billion a year now, the cost of climate impacts to the economy, and that's predicted to go to about 73 billion by 2060. Now, someone is paying for that, and that's the Australian people.
Yes.
From an emissions point of view, so I think energy, we're getting there, I think, but we have to stop deforestation. The most simple way we can actually start to slow down emissions is actually through what nature has provided us for absorbing carbon, which is trees and land use. And yet this Labor government is still not cracking down on native forest logging, and is not willing to look at those areas. So I think if I had a magic wand, I would be absolutely banning native forest logging immediately. Really, let's stop making the problem worse.
Yeah.
Right? We have to, at the very least, acknowledge the methods that we know are working and supercharge them.
You mentioned gas, and that is kind of like that's some coming to the fore now. Everyone they love talking about it as a transition fuel, and it's not as bad as coal. So maybe we need it after all. And of course, the other issue is that we now have this very, very large export trade. So, and scope 3 emissions, that means that we are actually exporting a lot of these emissions overseas. It's a lot of money with
But it's not a lot of money to the Australian people. Let's be really clear for
true,
people.
true.
This
That is
big
true.
export trade makes a lot of money for private international company, for those
Yes.
entities. It does not make a lot of money for the Australian people. So ironically, this is a resource of the Australian people. It is under our area or our continent. It is
Yes.
getting extracted and sent over for profit, a great profit, but very little revenue to the Australian people. This is not an industry that pays back the Australian people.
Yeah.
So the idea that, and I really, gas is not a transition fuel. Let's be really clear about that. It is not a transition fuel. In fact, it is an incredibly harmful fuel because it has a highly warming capacity. Again, LNG is methane, and that is 80 times more potent than CO2 when it comes to the warming over the first 20 years. So we need to be really clear that use of gas should be minimized and only kept for what is absolutely essential for. We should think of it as a rarely used resource only when absolutely necessary. So gas should play no part in domestic residential use. We should not be wasting that resource on heating or cooking. It has great impacts on health and lots of other things. The fact that it's needed for peaking power for manufacturing, for example, I recognize that. But then let's limit it to that, and let's prioritize that domestic use over the vast profits companies are making through their export markets.
Yeah.
We know, for example, Japan buys our gas, on-sells it at great profit, and then are the first to come back and argue that Australia should open up more basins and we should continue with
It's
that.
it is extraordinary that our own domestic gas is set by the price that that costs overseas, where it's rarer and more expensive to buy.
It's an absolute failure of government.
It is, and so what is the core reason for that? Because as a punter, you look at these logics and you delve in for 5 minutes. You think it's obviously crazy. Why are we in the situation? And it seems to be, regardless, in fact, whether it's Liberal or Labour, that there is still this reluctance to address some of these really egregious trade relationships we have. What do you think accounts for that? Why are we signing up for international companies to come and take the gas, take away, sell it, and actually pay less to us than I pay on my income tax? Anyone out there paying on their are paying more as a percentage than big companies from? Why does that happen?
Well, I think that shows the power of lobby groups and the power of the fossil fuel groups on our traditional major political parties, that they have been able to dupe the Australian people into thinking that this is the way it should be, when absolutely this is an absolute rort, and the Australian people are absolutely missing out. And yet government after government, whether it be a coalition government or a Labor government, is allowing this to continue.
How important is independence for the Teals? I know you first got in big when it was just getting started. You had no Teals funding. You did it all yourself. But nevertheless, the power of the Teals seemed to be kind of growing. Is that independence as opposed to being a party? Is it ever a conversation like we should get together formally?
Look, how it arose is actually individual communities frustrated at the status quo, that, as you say, the situation when you look at gas, for example, communities are looking at our political landscape and going, surely we can do better. It is ridiculous that our two major parties, the only two options we have, are so I think, embedded with fossil fuel interests and just reckless to the risks that we face in the future. And so communities come together to look for alternatives. The Australian democratic system is a great system where we have compulsory voting and preferential voting, but you need options on the ballot paper. So communities have risen to say, here are community independents to give you an option. It is a growing base. A third of Australian voters look for alternative as a primary vote now, which is a huge departure from the major parties. We work collaboratively and well together. The idea that it has to be under the guise of a party, I think, again, is a constraint of convention that we can work around. And so I think we are effectively putting up alternatives for a number of communities, but we need that to grow, keeping in mind the major parties have colluded to make that a lot harder for us in the future. And so I think the community independent movement will also need to evolve to meet the new restrictions of the legislation changes.
Sure. We're almost at time, and I know it's a very busy day here in Parliament. One last question. We next year, COP31. We're not hosting it, but we are guiding the president of the something or other. We're guiding the narrative, let's say. To the extent that you have influence and that you can help can push things, what would you say is there an opportunity for COP31 to deliver something to be of value? I think a lot of us watch each year another COP, and starting to wonder, actually, what is the point of these gatherings? Do you have any expectation that with Australia taking a leading role in setting the narrative and asking the questions, etc., that we have some potential? And if so, what would you like to see that potential?
Well, I would like to see methane much higher on the agenda of focus of how we have to properly monitor, measure it to account for it. I was very disappointed when we gave up on the opportunity to host COP31, because I think for our Pacific neighbours, incredibly important for them to be able to be front and centre of COP, and they are living from an existential point of view the reality of climate change. Obviously, we are in an interesting time from a geopolitical point of view, having the US under Trump withdraw from the Paris Agreement. That leaves a vacuum and a void from an international point of view of leadership. We know China is geopolitically it is difficult from a security point of view for Australia, but then they are also progressing the transition to renewable energy. They are the largest manufacturer, installer. They are moving in leaps and bounds when it comes to clean technology. Obviously, you have a lot of other issues at play. So I think it's more important than ever that we have our coalition of the willing, of nations that are united around recognizing the risks of climate change and the need for comprehensive global reform and sound policy. So COP will continue to play a really important role in that. But we need to ensure fossil fuels stop having as much influence as they do over COPs, right? We cannot have situations where gas companies and others are sponsoring and funding and astro-turfing COP outcomes.
You mentioned this kind of interesting relationship we now have with China because when I was growing up and for most of my adult life, there's always been China's always been a kind of never been necessarily a friend to when I used to live in the UK and in Australia. There's always a sense of apprehension, and that they're not democracy, etc. They do terrible things with Uyghurs. They do lots of damage with the environment, and yet here we are. If we have any crack at staying to 2%, 2 degrees, it will only be because of what China's doing and what it has done in the last 3 or 4 years in terms of the massive scaling up for PV and all of that. Does that must be interesting being a politician responsible for the national interests of your community, of your electorate, but also recognizing there's such a dependence. There is a dependence on China if we are to try and meet our climate commitments. How do you sort of negotiate that in your mind? How do you deal with the fact that a strong, powerful communist country to our north is now really a country that we depend on for our climate policies?
Well, I don't know if I would frame it that way. I don't think we depend on them for our climate policy, but I think they are
achieving the outcomes of our policies.
They are leading the way when it comes to the development of technology and manufacturing capability around clean technologies. I had the opportunity to go on a parliamentary delegation trip to China to visit, for example, steel manufacturing, and for them to focus for that to become green steel is incredibly important. For them to keep investing into those cleaner technologies. Obviously, we know a lot of Pacific nations and other nations are for them it's existential what happens with climate, and that plays into the geopolitical aspect of things, and who do they turn to for assistance. And the US's position has essentially vacated the field and vacated responsibility of where we're heading globally. But then again, I think the current play around Greenland is interesting. I don't accept that it's a security thing. I think it's a rare earth and minerals mining play from the US. So I think we are in an incredibly changing time.
Or even an interesting time, you might say.
I think slightly scary time, but then it reinforces the need that we can't just be passengers, mere observers. We have to participate and do what we can, and that is through our voting for sensible policy, voting for representatives that care about these issues, what we do with our money, and then what we do with a lot as consumers, how we run our lives.
Zali, I think you're in need somewhere else. I'm getting signals that you are in need. So I'd like to thank you for your time today for Climate 360.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Sam, was it worth it driving all the way up to Canberra?
Oh, yes, it was definitely worth it. Not only is it a very pretty drive, but getting to the seat of Australian democracy and going all the way into Parliament House to have that conversation with a politician who is so comfortable with complexity, who goes looking for facts to drive decision making. It was a relief.
And I have to say to our audience, Zali snuck us in between an ABC interview and a presentation she was giving in the chamber to national TV. We had like 42 minutes, and at the end she had to literally, I think, run between her office to the chamber to be able to make her scheduled speech. So hats off, Zali, for giving us some of your precious time.
Yeah, absolutely. That was really generous and really illuminating. the knowledge that you need to make decisions on behalf of your community. It's very clear about what she needs to be able to see. We know that methane is 80 times more impactful than carbon dioxide, and that time is of the essence. And so, as somebody who could be making decisions about that, she wants to know where the data is, that Australia doesn't have an accurate way of measuring the emissions that escape from the normal processes of extracting fossil fuels, which with that information, you can start quantifying its impact and how important it is to change those processes.
It's extraordinary that that something as important as that, and also something as relatively easy to implement. I mean, other parts of the world do implement fugitive emissions a lot better than we do. And so, that's just a lack of knowledge that there's no excuse for. I mean, another lack of knowledge there's no excuse for, which Zali mentioned, was the report that was done by the Australian Office of National Intelligence that did a report into climate risks, and they tabled that report to the Albanese government in 2022. No part of that report has been made available to the public. Now, bearing in mind that this report almost certainly will have dealt with the rise of uninsurability in housing, the increased risk of inundation, the increased risk of drought, food security, immigration trends from other of our neighbors, etc., like big issues. And what makes it really frustrating is that when we talk about taking action in relation to climate, the big talking point is it costs 2 billion or 10 billion or 50 billion or 200 billion dollars. Now, we are in no way able to tell whether those investments are worthwhile unless we know, or else, what else are we facing? So we're kind of fighting with one hand tied behind our back because we know what costs are in terms of implementing change, but we don't know what costs are in terms of not implementing change, which almost certainly will have been a part of that report. So why the government would ask for a report to be created and that not make any part of that report publicly available is nothing short, I think, of a scandal, Sam.
It's in terms of situations being hard to understand and cloudy, certainly resonated with the conversation that we had with Saul Griffith, was the extent to which the work that people do at home is making a big difference, that there's kind of two sets of numbers we need to be bearing in mind. One is 75% of the climate change related impact that we have at home. And so making a difference at home makes a big difference to that number. But then you need the other lens, which is going back to those industrial processes and the scope 3 emissions that mean that Australia has that work to do as well. And so it left me sort of conscious that we're making more progress than we think, which only makes these other issues that much more compelling to get on top of.
No, totally. And I think she did mention that point about we're exporting all these fossil fuels, which makes our scope 3 emissions absolutely ginormous, and yet we're getting so little back. I mean, this is reiterated, obviously, and I don't know if you follow Punter Politics, that fella on Instagram, who talks a lot about the gas companies making billions and billions of dollars and giving very little of it back to us. So I think it's it was a good conversation. We covered lots of ground, and I think that this question about how we calculate the cost both of action and inaction is a very important one, and one that we'll be picking up with Michael Liebreich in our next conversation. Michael is in Australia for a couple of weeks, so we're catching up with him. And of course, Michael wrote quite an influential paper a couple months ago called the Pragmatic Reset, around basically a kind of the status quo of where things are at with the energy transition. And we're looking forward to speaking to him. And I hope you can join us for that episode coming up in a couple of weeks' time.
I'll see you then.
See you then.